I was 13 when Clara and I were taken, and every sound, every shadow of those days still lives inside me. It began on a hot July afternoon, our bicycles racing each other down the dirt road home from the river. Clara was ahead, her curls bouncing as she laughed when the truck appeared. Rusted, loud, blocking the path. The doors slammed, and 2 men grabbed us before I even understood what was happening. They drove us into the woods, to an old cabin with boarded windows, where the air smelled of mold and rot. They tied us, shoved us into a corner, and told us our families would pay if they wanted us back. Their voices were cold, the kind that stripped away all the safety I had ever known. The first night I told myself it would be over quickly. Surely someone would find us. Surely our parents would call the police. But then I saw the men's faces under the dim lantern light. Hard, practiced, patient. They weren't rushing. They weren't scared. They knew what they were doing. The phone calls started the next day. One of them carried a briefcase with a radio phone. Big, clunky, nothing like the ones we have now. He dialed numbers, and I heard my father's voice crackle faintly on the other end. The man demanded money, threatening to hurt us if the police got too close. Then he hung up. The next calls came from different numbers, different voices, sometimes masked with accents. My father, desperate, begged to hear me. But they never let us speak. Only once did they shove the receiver against my ear and tell me to say I was alive. I whispered, "Daddy," my voice trembling, before the phone was yanked away. The line went dead. Later, I would learn the police traced the calls. But they were always from numbers bouncing through fake lines, showing up as if they came from overseas, London, Mexico, even Brazil. But we weren't overseas. We were right there in Vermont, hidden in plain woods. The calls were smoke and mirrors, meant to confuse, to buy the kidnappers time. We tried to escape once. The men had been drinking, their speech slurred, their footsteps heavy. Clara worked the rope loose, her fingers bleeding from the effort. We slipped through the door into the night, the forest cool and damp, stars above us. For one moment, I thought freedom was ours, but boots thundered behind us. Flashlights tore through the trees. We ran until our lungs burned, but they caught us, dragging us back, their rage shaking the air. Clara took the worst of it, slapped, shoved, tied so tight her wrists swelled purple. They told us if we tried again, they'd leave one of us in the woods, as an example. I never forgot the way Clara looked at me that night, her eyes telling me she'd risk it again anyway, because freedom was worth any price. While we despaired in that cabin, the police in our town searched tirelessly. They scoured the rivers, the barns, the back roads. Neighbors formed lines, sweeping through fields. But every time the police got close, it was as if the kidnappers already knew. They moved us from the cabin to a cellar under an abandoned farmhouse, then to a shack by the quarry. Every move came just before the police arrived. It was like someone was warning them. At the time, I didn't know. I only felt the hopelessness of being dragged from one hiding place to another, always in the dark, always blindfolded so we couldn't remember the paths. But later, when the truth came out, I understood. There was a traitor, someone from our own neighborhood, someone who smiled at us at church, who waved at my parents in the grocery store. That person was feeding the kidnappers every detail of the search. The calls to our families grew crueler. The kidnappers demanded more money, changing the ransom sum, threatening to cut off contact if the police kept pressing. My father's farm was mortgaged to the bone, and Clara's family wasn't wealthy either. They didn't have what the kidnappers wanted, but desperation makes people promise anything. The police tried to stall, tried to keep the men talking, but it was like chasing shadows. I remember one particular night in the farmhouse cellar. Rain leaked through the boards above, dripping on the dirt floor. The men had a small radio playing, and through the static we heard the news. Reporters were talking about us, about the missing girls, about the town holding vigils in the church. I pressed closer to Clara, whispering that people hadn't forgotten us. People were still looking. She squeezed my hand, her lips trembling. But she didn't cry. She was always braver than me. The kidnappers grew paranoid. They started moving us every 2 days, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes before dawn. We'd be shoved into the back of the truck, ropes biting into our wrists, the smell of gasoline filling our noses. I began to lose track of time. My body ached from bruises, from hunger, from fear. My mind wandered into dark corners. What if they decided we weren't worth the risk? What if they silenced us forever? But the police weren't giving up. They had officers working around the clock, trying to trace the phantom calls. They put pressure on the phone company, on border patrols, even on federal agents. The kidnappers thought they were clever, but with every call, every slip, the net drew tighter. And yet, each time the police planned a raid, the house came up empty, the cellar abandoned, the ropes still warm where we'd been tied. Someone was feeding them information. I didn't know then who it was, but years later, when the truth was told, I learned it was a man who lived only 3 houses away from mine. A man who'd once given me peppermints from his pocket, who'd waved as Clara and I rode by on our bikes. He was no stranger in a dark alley. He was a neighbor. He was their eyes and ears. And that betrayal cut deeper than anything the kidnappers did. But the police eventually caught on. They noticed how every search came up just minutes too late. They noticed how one man always seemed to know when vigils were planned, when search parties left, when money was being gathered. They began to watch him, quietly, to test their theories with false trails. Meanwhile, Clara and I endured. In one shack there was a small crack in the wall where moonlight spilled in. We would press our faces to it, breathing the outside air, dreaming of freedom. In another there were mice that scurried across the dirt floor at night, and Clara whispered that if they could find their way in and out, maybe we could too. She always found hope, even in the smallest things. I tried to be brave for her, but I was breaking. My body was thinner, my spirit fraying. I thought often of my mother's kitchen, of warm bread, of the way my father's hands felt when he patted my shoulder. Those memories became my prayers, my shield against despair. And then, one night, everything shifted. The kidnappers had just finished another call, their voices sharp, angry. The police had offered proof of money, but the men didn't trust it. They argued, one insisting they cut their losses and flee, the other demanding they hold out for more. Clara and I lay in the corner, listening, hardly daring to breathe. That was when the floor above us creaked, not with their steps, but heavier, more deliberate. Then came the faintest whisper of radios crackling. The kidnappers stiffened. They'd heard it too. One bolted for the door, shouting, "They found us again!" Clara's hand gripped mine. My heart slammed against my ribs. Was this it? Were we about to be saved? Or silenced? The men grabbed their guns. Boots pounded above. And the world turned into chaos. The chaos of that night is burned into me like a scar. The kidnappers bolted out the back door, guns flashing in the moonlight, dragging us by the ropes. We stumbled over roots and stones as they pulled us through the woods. Behind us, voices shouted. Police voices. Orders cut the night air. "Surround the house! Don't let them get away!" Then gunshots cracked, sharp and terrible, echoing through the trees. The men shoved us into the back of the truck, slammed the doors, and roared down a dirt path that jolted my teeth. Clara pressed against me, her breath coming fast. I felt her tears hot on my shoulder, But she whispered anyway. "They're close. The police are close. Don't give up." We rode for what felt like hours, but later I'd learn it was only 40 minutes. The kidnappers switched vehicles at a barn on the edge of another county. They forced us into a car this time. Low, cramped, smelling of tobacco. Every move was precise, practiced. They'd done this before. The car rolled into another hiding place, a half-finished house with tarps for windows and piles of lumber stacked inside. They shoved us into a back room and paced like trapped animals. One of them cursed the police, spitting words like venom. The other paced with his hands through his hair, muttering, "We got warned. Somebody tipped us. They always do." At the time, I didn't know what he meant. But years later, when the truth came out, I realized he was talking about their inside man, the black sheep among us. For 2 more weeks, Clara and I were dragged from one hole to another. Sometimes it was a boarded-up motel room. Sometimes it was a shed by the quarry. Each time the police closed in, but each time the kidnappers slipped away just before the trap shut. It was like watching a nightmare on repeat, like we were mice being toyed with by cats. The phone calls to our families never stopped, always from fake numbers, always bouncing through phantom lines that showed as international. My father nearly broke under the weight of it. Later he told me how he begged the sheriff, pleaded with the FBI, prayed every night. They told him to be patient, to trust the process. But how does a father trust when his daughter's life is a bargaining chip? One call still haunts me. The kidnappers let Clara's mother hear her voice for a moment. Clara tried to sound brave, but when the phone was pulled away, she sobbed into my arms. "Mama's breaking," she whispered. I heard it in her voice. She's breaking. And still, the police chased ghosts, until the sheriff tried something different. He called in the state investigators, men with sharper eyes and fewer attachments. They started studying the failures, the near captures, the empty barns, the abandoned cabins, and they noticed a pattern. Every time the police organized a search party, the kidnappers had already moved us. Every time ransom negotiations advanced, the kidnappers grew bolder. Someone was feeding them real-time information. So the sheriff set a trap. He staged a plan in front of only a handful of trusted officers. He spread word quietly that the girls, Clara and I, were suspected to be hidden in an old mill on the north edge of town. He let just enough of that rumor slip to the neighborhood. Then he waited. That night, the kidnappers moved us again. Not to the mill, but to a distant barn in another county. And when the sheriff compared notes, he knew. Someone local had warned them. Someone close. Suspicion fell on a neighbor named Roy. He lived 3 houses down from mine, a man in his 40s who fixed cars and smiled at everyone. He'd come to the vigils, lit candles, even hugged my mother with tears in his eyes. But the investigators noticed things. The way he always seemed to appear near the sheriff's office, the way he asked subtle questions, the way his phone record showed calls at odd hours. So they watched him, quietly, patiently, and one night, they caught him. Roy was standing at a payphone on the edge of town, whispering into the receiver, giving directions. The line was tapped. The call was traced. He was reporting to the kidnappers, warning them of the next search. When they arrested him, he broke down, swore he was only helping friends who promised him a cut of the ransom. Helping friends, while 2 girls rotted in captivity. When the news reached the kidnappers, panic set in. Their safe line was gone. Their mole was gone. And the police, armed with the trace, finally had a thread to pull. The kidnappers moved us again, this time in a frenzy. They didn't blindfold us properly. Too rushed, too angry. For the first time, I glimpsed the roads, the bend of the river, the shape of a church steeple. I tucked those images into my memory, Clinging to them like lifelines, they shoved us into a decrepit trailer deep in the woods. Days passed in silence except for the occasional sound of helicopters overhead. Clara grew thinner, weaker, her hands trembling when she tried to untie her ropes. I held her close, whispering stories about home, about warm bread and summer fireflies, about freedom. Then, one night, everything changed. The trailer walls shook with the roar of engines. Lights flooded the windows, bright, blinding. Voices thundered outside. "Police! Come out with your hands up!" the kidnappers cursed, scrambling for their guns. One shoved Clara and me into the bathroom, slamming the door. I heard the window shatter, heard boots hitting the floor, heard the chaos of men colliding in the dark. Gunfire erupted, loud, violent, final. Then silence. The door burst open, and a man in uniform stood there, his vest heavy with gear, his face stern but kind. "You're safe now," he said. His voice cracked with relief. "You're safe." I collapsed into his arms. Clara sobbed, clutching my hand. We were lifted out of that hell, carried past the sight of two men on the floor, their weapons kicked aside. Their reign of terror ended. The aftermath was a blur. The police pieced together the trail, unraveling months of deception. The kidnappers had been changing locations with the help of Roy, the neighbor, who fed them every move the town made. He was sentenced to decades behind bars, his name cursed by everyone who'd ever called him friend. The two kidnappers, career criminals with records of robbery and violence, never saw daylight again, and Clara and we went home. The town lined the streets when we returned, people cheering, crying, holding signs of welcome. But for us, it wasn't simple joy. We carried scars, some visible, some buried deep. For years I woke at night to the sound of phantom ropes cutting into my wrists, to the memory of Clara's trembling hand in mine. Yet we survived. We lived to tell it. And when I stand now at my window, watching the street where Roy once lived, I remind myself that evil doesn't always come from shadows. Sometimes it comes from the house 3 doors down, from a man with a smile too easy, too practiced. But I also remind myself of the sheriff, of the officers who never gave up, of the neighbors who prayed, of the families who held vigils. I remind myself that light will always hunt the darkness, even when it hides in familiar places. And that's the story, child. The story of how we were stolen, how betrayal nearly buried us, and how truth and persistence saved us in the end.